Good evening, everybody. Yes, so I was 2 weeks ago in the United Kingdom at Milton Keyes to do one of the tests I need to do to be an accredited battlefield or a badged member of the Guild of Battlefield Guides. And I had to do a 30-minute presentation to members of the Guild, assessed by accredited members. And I had this nice little old man walk up to me and said, "Are you the young man that's going to be talking about the Battle of Saint-Julien?" And I said, "Yes, sir, that would be me." He says, "I'm looking forward to seeing you talk." And I was very happy about this. And then one of the more senior guides who I know walked up to me and said, "You do realize he is the world's foremost expert on the Battle of Saint-Julien as a battlefield tour guide. Good luck." And then that nice little old man decided to sit in the front row right in front of me as I was about to present. So I did pass the assignment. It turns out I was the last presenter of the day or of the session. And I had one of the founding members. I had three of the world's best World War I battlefield guides all in the front row. Lots of the accredited and experienced guides came to see me present because I'm one of the few Canadians. And so I passed the assignment, but needless to say, it was a little intimidating when this nice little old man sat up front and was super interested in my presentation. I was terrified, but I passed it. It's one of my favorite battles to talk about. And we're actually going to talk about that particular battle coming up in April, which is going to be fun. So into the presentation. So MFS Europe is not affiliated with me as my Woolsey's War Walks company or anything that I'm talking about, any of the locations or things like that. These are just things that I recommend to people, and they don't sponsor me. This is something they've asked me to do because they needed somebody to do this. And battlefield tours are really, really popular, and it's a really good way to get them. So we're going to give a quick overview of Italy itself and where Ortona is, some recommended preparations and travel advisories, some helpful tricks, what you must try in food. If you're going to Italy and you don't try the yummy food, you're missing half the experience of Italy. We're going to talk about some really great places to stay, transportation, and I'm not supposed to be those locations. Did I load the wrong? That's the right presentation. So we're actually going to be talking day by day of the Battle of Ortona. And it's going to be kind of a blow by blow each day over the 8 days of the battle. So we're talking about Italy itself in the province of Chieti in the region of Abruzzo. So the population of the area is about 22,000 people. The main language, of course, is Italian. The main airports nearby are Rome, Fiumicino, or Campiano, but there is one about 30 minutes north called Pescara. It's a smaller airport. It's small. It's a little out of the way, but it's totally, it's doable. It just doesn't have great flights. This is an ancient town on the Adriatic coast. It became one of the first kind of resort towns in Italy, and actually the Italian royal family escaped through the port of Ortona to evade the Nazis in the Second World War. There's lots of ancient ruins and castles and all that, all in this area. It's absolutely stunningly gorgeous, and it's on the Adriatic, which has got beautiful beaches. Like, it's not just about battlefields there. So Italy is the 27th most expensive country in the world to live in, and they're kind of slightly higher than the European average. So not unreasonable for holidaying there. So cool thing about Ortona, the city walls were built these city walls were built in the first half of the 15th century, and the castle was originally designed or commissioned in 1447. And it turns out this place has got relics dating as far back as the Romans. And there was a whole bunch of stuff found in 2005 around the remains of the castle there. It's also known for its wonderful beaches up and down north and south of the town. There's a ton of beautiful beaches. I spent the day on one. They were just absolutely lovely. Like, this is resort / history all in one. Sorry. There we go. So summers are really hot and humid, and winters are kind of cold and wet. So your main traveling season is spring to fall, May to September, but be aware that when you're going in July and August, it's really hot. So just something to be aware of. Dress for the heat in the summer and good walking footwear. The nice thing about this battlefield we're talking about, it's only a couple of kilometers. You actually physically walk it, you don't drive it. It's all very, very, very close. Please make sure you have travel and medical insurance. You never know what goes wrong. The town and most of the resorts are child friendly in the neighborhood. They acquire quite a family thing. And there are no city passes in this part of Italy. It's pretty small town in a sense, but it's that beautiful small town Italy feeling that you get there. It's one of my favorite towns to visit. So there's no travel advisories. It's got the usual COVID preparations, of course. There's no visa requirements if you're coming in from, of course, a Schengen or friendly country. Security considerations, there's the usual tourist theft type problem. You lock up your valuables, don't leave things exposed. But when I was there was never any real problems the times I've been there. There is a hospital in Ortona, which is convenient. Their emergency number is 112, and the only embassy in Italy or consulate is actually in Rome itself, which is about 3 hours away on the opposite side of the coast on the Tyrrhenian Sea. There's some links there for the Government Canada advisories and the European advisories. Just when we share the presentation, they're there for you. So Ortona, this is a real, as I said earlier, this is a really walkable battlefield. And it all took place pretty much inside of the town of Ortona. But again, footwear is really important. We're talking some old cobblestone streets, and you're going to be walking a long distance. Flip-flops are not the footwear of choice. But again, I said, in the summer months, you want to be prepared for hot. I think I was there and it was 36 or 38 degrees that day. It was like crazy hot and very sunny, like very sunny. Please remember that this is actually where people live in their lives. So you have to really be careful about their privacy and their property, because what we think is, oh, this would be cool to see, is actually somebody's place and they own that. So you have to be careful of that. And as I said, it's more than just a Second World War battlefield. There's so much heritage and history there. The picture on the right-hand side is part of what's left of the castle at Ortona. And there's Roman stuff there, as I said, if you like Roman stuff. And it's just, there's just so much to enjoy in this part of the world that you will not run short of things to do. So some must-try food. This is the first must-try food. This is Porfino. It's an herbal liquor. It was created in 1858. It's produced in Shetty, and it's made with a secret recipe, I'm told, with 42 different herbs, roots, and seeds. And it's flavored and colored with saffron, which is harvested in the region. I've actually never had it, but it came highly recommended. It was just, I had to drive, so I wasn't drinking that day, but it's really highly recommended. Italian is also known as Terra Talesi. It's one of the smallest Italian DOCG winery regions. It's located around the town of Tulo and Chieti, which is just north of this area. It produces some great red wines and some white wines as well. And it's also one of the oldest varieties in this area. It's quite tasty. I do recommend their wines. And if you like meat, this is a cured salami. I'm going to mispronounce this terribly. It's Ventrica della Vetasa. It's coarsely chopped pork with garlic and peppers and black pepper and fennel seeds, and then it's cured and most of the mold is removed, and then it's coated with a thing of lard. It is so delicious. It is really good. Like there's, and this is just a smattering of the food options in there. These are ones known for that specific province and region. But yeah, if you eat badly in Italy, you've done something really wrong. All right. Best places to stay inside the town of Ortona itself. There's a couple of hotels. The Hotel Vico 59 is quite a nice one, and the one on the right, which is the Hotel Ideal. Again, another lovely place to stay. They're in town. There's not a lot of hotels, but they're kind of nice little quaint older places to stay. They're both quite nice. But saying that, if you go outside of town, just like 15-20 minutes, you get the Hotel Mara Resort or the Hotel La Salle, and that's actually both on the ocean, and they have pools, and they're just lovely areas. There are several B&Bs, but like this is Italian holiday region. Like this is where people in Rome and in Italy go to holiday, is on the Adriatic coast. So you can make this a whole family adventure and then still have a battlefield tour. And that's what we did actually. The first time I went to Ortona with my family, we did beach time and I got to do battlefield. So there are no rideshare services, but there are taxis. Just be forewarned, taxis, you want to make sure you have prices in advance. Uber and Bolt aren't there. I checked. A battlefield tour guide is always a good idea. They give you context. They give you the story. If you have a personal connection, they can look into that. So some good resources to find guides. The Guild of Battlefield Guides, which I'm a member of. That's my member badge. I recommend them. They are excellent. You can find guides for almost any subject. any region, and they're some of the best in the world. In fact, some of them are the foremost experts and authors of those battles in the world. I'm also a great resource. I'm Woolsey's War Walks, as Amanda mentioned earlier. I have a Facebook page. You can message me there, and I can put tours together for you and guide you, and it's good. But there's also some options of local guides. Just do some research before you book to get what you want. Sometimes they have some pretty pre-canned tours that give you like, this is the Canadian tour, and they kind of skim over all the details without the intricate Canadian details. So just something to be aware of. It's also a good idea when you're driving to make sure you have your international driver's license. If you're flying into a destination and then renting a car, you want that. It makes it easier to rent a vehicle. And in some countries, it's absolutely mandated. So here's the good stuff. So this is the Battle of Ortona. So the Battle of Ortona was fought from the 20th to the 28th of December, 1943. And the preamble to this is that in September of 43, after the successful conclusion of Operation Husky, which the Canadians participated in, the Allies landed on the Italian mainland in September and began a campaign which has kind of become known as a secondary or the backwater theater. And it was that way for a lot of men and equipment. A lot of older equipment was used there. A lot less men were going there. So there were some real interesting challenges with that. But the goal was they were trying to tie up German forces in the south. And if they could capture and knock out Italy and take Rome, it was a huge, huge success. But they were still short of Rome. There was a long, hard fight. Italian geography is beautiful coastal regions with a nasty mountainous spine. It is a tough place to fight. And the Germans, of course, defended on a series of defensive lines and positions and were really kind of crazy. So in the fall of 1943, the American Fifth Army, which was actually only about 1/3 American, the rest of them were British and other forces, was on the Tyrrhenian Sea side of Italy, and the British Eighth Army was on the Adriatic coast, and that was commanded by General Bernard Montgomery, who was later to command the Canadians in the 21st Army Group in the Normandy landings. And they were part of British Fifth Corps under a British general, Lieutenant General Charles Alfrey. And at this point, in November of 1943, Major General Simons had become ill with jaundice and was taken out of command of the 1st Canadian Division. And he was replaced by the 2nd Canadian Brigade's commander, a guy named Chris Vokes. And so this is his first kind of major campaign as the divisional commander is going to happen now. So the attacks against the German winterland fortifications, which were kind of anchored at Ortona and trying to keep the Allies out of Rome, in fact, had begun in November of 1943, and they captured up to the ground until the Moro River, and that's when the Canadians actually came back into the line, and they began this fiercely contested advance with the 1st Canadian Division. So the 1st Canadian Brigade under Brigadier Howard Graham, later the Chief of the Defense Staff, actually in the 1950s. Led the initial attack, fought over a place called the Gully, quite a fierce set of battles. And so once they got that cleared, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade, under a guy named Brigadier Bert Hoffmeister, and now he had commanded the Seaforths Highlanders of Canada in Sicily. He's now the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade commander, which is interesting because he's actually a pre-war militia officer. And this brigade, 2nd Canadian Brigade, is made up of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, and the Loyal Edmonton Regiment. And so he's the main, and we're going to talk mostly about 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade, and we're going to talk about the Loyal Edmonton Regiment, and we're going to talk about the Seaforth Highlanders. There's also a 3rd unit that fought in the battle, but not the complete unit, and that's the Three Rivers Regiment, which was the tank unit that was in support. Their enemy, though, was a tough enemy. So they were fighting off or attacking the lines held by the German 1st Parachute Division under a guy named Major General Reichard Heinrich. So this is a very experienced unit, the Germans. They landed in Crete and helped conquer Crete. They'd done all the initial German landings. They're Luftwaffe people. They're not actually Wehrmacht German soldiers. They're Luftwaffe Air Force people. That's how the German military worked. And these are a tough bunch of guys. So on the 20th of December, the main action for Ortona began, because at 10 o'clock that morning, the sappers of the 4th Field Company of the Royal Canadian Engineers fixed a bridge that crossed this feature called the Gully, and this allowed the tanks of C Squadron under Major Frank Johnson of the Three Rivers Regiment and the Loyal Edmonton Regiment under a Lieutenant Colonel J.C. Jefferson, who has an armory named after him in Edmonton, in fact. They began to advance around about noon along the Ortona Road with the intention of occupying the buildings at the edge of the town. So if you're looking at the map on the map, you will see the blue line. That's the line of advance of the Loyal Edmonton Regiment. And so that 20th advance is the lower area, is the very first kind of bound. You're going to see this map a couple times as we go through. So you got the dates there to tell you what actions were happening, and you'll see some arrows pointing to where some events took place. So these guys were able to move up through the outskirts of the town behind an artillery barrage, meeting very little resistance. And they had about a 3,000-yard advance. The engineers at the same time were working to clear all the mines the Germans had laid, but still, as they were advancing, 4 tanks were disabled by mines, and 1 was completely destroyed, killing all of the crew. Those 4 crewmen are interned at Morrow River Cemetery. Their tank got hit a mine so big that it blew the turret into the air. It was a terrible, terrible explosion. By about 2:30 in the afternoon on the 20th, the Edmonton Regiment were on their actual objective. But as they got to that point, the resistance and the fighting became very, very, very severe. At the same time, C Company of the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, who were attacking along the coastal road, had climbed up a cliff on the southeast side of the town and were linking up with the very right-hand company, which was B Company of the Loyal Edmonton Regiment. As this link-up was happening, 8 anti-tank guns from the 90th Canadian Anti-Tank Battery, which are 6-pounder anti-tank guns. Takes more than 2 men in a push, but they're man-pushable anti-tank guns, the main infantry anti-tank gun of the Canadians in the war. A platoon of machine guns from the Saskatoon Light Infantry, which is the support weapons battalion of the 1st Canadian Division. They also came up. They moved into the C Company area, which is kind of on the left-hand side of the town, or the western side of the town. And they joined the 12 surviving tanks of C Squadron and the LERs. With D Company was actually on the left-hand, was on the northwest side of the road under a man named Major Stone. He later gained fame. He was the PPCLI commander in Korea. In fact, he was the PPCLI commander that took the PPCLI to Korea, and he commanded D Company. And B Company was actually on the main road itself, with A and C companies were actually operating in support. And so C Company was kind of farther behind and going to link up with the Seaforths. During the advance, fighters and fighter bombers of the Desert Air Force swarmed over the German lines, striking at supply depots and attacking artillery and infantry units as they were moving around in the background. The Canadians benefited from something called the newly invented cab rank, which was 6 fighter bombers that were stacked up around each other, and they were controlled by somebody called a rover, who was a forward air controller on the ground, and he was pretty much responsible for them. And so they had a certain amount of time. They were literally on call. At any one time, there was always 6 of them sitting over Ortona. So that is the 20th. So the 2 photos here on the right are actually going to take place on the 21st, which is the next day. And at 7 a.m. on the 21st, the attack into the town itself began. This medieval town was dominated by a 15th century castle and was made up of narrow and dark, cramped streets. The newer sections were laid out in a very rectangular block pattern, but only the main roads were big enough to handle the tanks. And the Sherman tank is not a big tank, but these are some pretty narrow roads, and they still are. The buildings in the town were generally about four stories tall, and that added to the challenge because, of course, now you've got these big, tall buildings that can look down on you, which is a real challenge. The terrain outside of the town, of course, was limiting the Canadian advance, which had to be from the south and along a Route 16, now Highway 16, the main road into town. Because on the other side, of course, there was steep escarpments going up. And on the other side, of course, was the ocean, as you can tell from this map. The Loyal Edmonton Regiment moved 2 companies forward, B and D companies leading on the 21st. And at this point, the companies were about 90 men strong, which isn't a full-size rifle company at the time, but we are in a war. And they had some tanks in support from the Three Rivers Regiment. As well, those tanks and some of the infantry were pushing along some anti-tank guns through the street to help support. And so they spent the entire day of the 21st of December clearing no more than a score of buildings, which made up the southern outskirts of the town. and by nightfall had made it to the Piazza Vittoria, which is where the red and the blue arrows meet, kind of in the bottom third of the picture on the map. You'll see it there. And they basically they were only about a quarter of a mile from the central square in the town of Ortona itself. The Seaforth's C Company fought to capture the church of Santa Maria di Costantinopoli, the southeast corner of the town. You can see it near the date December or 20 December. It's at the bottom of the map. So again, this is not a big space. And by the afternoon, the rest of the Seaforths were ordered up to help and move into and cross over and support the Loyal Edmonton taking the town. So the Seaforths, of course, then hopscotched or crossed the LER lines. So B Company of the Seaforths moving up a lot that mine path. That path is roughly where that arrow is today. So they're actually waiting for mines to get cleared by the Royal Canadian Engineers on the 21st. That comes from the Seaforth Highlanders website and their war diary. And the other man on the left, it's a fairly famous photo. I don't know where it's taken in Ortona, that I couldn't confirm, but that is Corporal E.A. Harris of the Loyal Edmonton Regiment. And it was confirmed by the Library Archive Canada that was taken on the 21st of December, 1943. He did not survive the battle. He was actually killed in action on the 27th of December. I don't know which company. I haven't figured that one out, but I suspect that he belonged to something that we're going to hear about a little bit later, which was an absolutely tragic. So this is just as these guys are getting into the worst part of the fighting of the town. So the 22nd of December dawned with the report reports of a German demolition plan, with only the Corso Vittoria Emanuele being barricade free. There was about 300 yards of that road was barricade free. The Germans blew houses, buildings, whatever they could to block all the other roads and build roadblocks to basically channel the Canadians into where they wanted them to be. This channel was created along the main street and channeled the Canadians, on that road up until the Piazza Municipale, and it created a really difficult killing ground. So Colonel Jefferson and the LERs decided to clear both sides at the same time so that the engineers could deal with the mines and the tanks could be brought up. With A Company on the left and D Company on the right, and B providing some flank support between the road and the harbor, this soon became a fight of platoon and section-sized actions, in which the system of reporting each house to be clear before moving on to the next one was started. And so house by house, block by block, room by room, the LER worked forward with the tanks, and by nightfall had just moved short of the Piazza Municipale, which was blocked by rubble. What the Germans had fought very stubbornly, like for every floor, every room, in every house. They were laying tons of booby traps. They knocked down walls, made fortifications in the rubbles, and covered their barricades with machine guns. It was to the point where the infantry of the LERs were having to use and create improvised ways to blow holes, either from the bottom or the top, to take buildings. So sometimes they would enter from the bottom at the beginning, but later in the battle, Colonel Stone, in an interview in the 1960s, literally said that they were coming from the top, and they were using either captured German explosives, teller mines, or something called a Hawkins mine. It's not really something you throw. It's like a man-portable anti-tank mine. And they would put 3 or 4 of those on a stick, and they would push it against the wall and hold it and then blow it up to blow holes. It was called mouseholing. In fact, this is where the term was essentially created, was in this fight. So the tanks of the Three River Regiment not only fired into every single building and strong point, but they also covered the infantry advances by covering them with heavy machine gun fire. They carried ammunition forward and helped evacuate the wounded. One of the most brutal parts of it was the fact that anti-tank guns were dragged over all of this rubble and through the streets, being brought up to blow away barricades, buildings, and snipers. So they're hauling these 6-pound guns, which are usually towed by a Bren carrier or a truck, and they're actually pushing them by hand. The 23rd of December, the LER continued, but the pace and the scale of the fighting had them at only 200 yards on that day. On the left, making it as far as the Piazza San Tommaso in front of the cathedral. And they captured on the southern end of the Corso Umberto. Luckily enough, there was a barricade in there. It's called the rubble pile, and they literally rolled up anti-tank guns to blast it away. But the result of this heavy fighting on the 23rd, the LER suffered so many casualties that the already small companies were now down to 60 men per platoon, or sorry, 60 men per company. With the injection of the sea force, this allowed the town to be kind of split into two, with the sea force, as I said earlier, taking the western half of the town. The 24th of December, the fighting in the west of the town intensified. And this happened to be fighting around a school. So if you look at the map, you'll see the red, you'll see the number December 24. There's a red cross, and opposite that is the school. And the fighting had to be suspended there by the sea force because they discovered some 300 civilians sheltering in the school. They had to basically be evacuated before the fighting could continue. They also couldn't take the hospital because it too was full of civilians, and they also had to be evacuated. Now, what did happen though, the same time, is the third, one of the battalions from the 1st Brigade, the 48th Highlanders of Canada, broke through German lines northwest of the town, hoping to cut off the defenders. And then the Germans ended up surrounding and cutting them off, and then they had to get rescued. So every attempt the Canadians were making, the Germans were fighting. The LER on the 24th of December, 1943, faced one other fearsome weapon. The Germans added flamethrowers to their defenses and started using them on the Canadians. The Canadian 90th Anti-Tank Battery had moved up to the high ground on the coastal road and then placed two big, heavy 17-pounder anti-tank guns. These things shoot, theoretically, a solid shot 17-pound ball at you. It's the most deadly anti-tank gun of the war, in fact. And they directed these guns into the town, and they were firing them directly at the flamethrower attacks. So every time the flamethrower would fire, the 17-pounders would open fire on where the attacks were going in, where the flamethrowers were going in. It's mind-boggling that they were throwing that much firepower at them. This day, also, lucky enough, the Edmonton Regiment was reinforced by 75 reinforcements. As well, C Squadron from the Three Rivers Regiment was so battered that A Squadron of the Three Rivers Regiment, under Major E.W. Smith, moved in to take over. And he basically didn't last long in the fight before he was badly wounded, talking to the infantry of the LER, trying to coordinate what was going to happen next. And he got wounded outside of his tank, and he got replaced by a man named Major R. Houston, a replacement officer. So the Three Rivers tank in the bottom, that's in Dead Horse Square. And it was called Dead Horse Square because the Canadians saw a dead horse in the middle of the square, and that's what it was named for the rest of the battle. And so that's right near that school and hospital. The rest of this photo, which I've cropped out because it's kind of a little bit much, there's those two tanks are advancing, and there's two other tanks in the off to the left of this photo. Two of the crewmen were badly wounded. One of them later died. So they were actually being medically evacuated, and you saw that in the rest of that photo. The other one is the Three Rivers Regiment and another Three Rivers tank moving up down the Corso Vittorio Emanuele in the old town of Ortona on the 22nd itself. So the fact that they're moving up the street, that means they're far enough away from the Germans that they're not in direct combat. The Edmonton Regiment and the AC Force, both their war diaries, every history, every interview, you literally could not move down the streets without getting cut down. So the 25th of December, this is a fairly famous day. And this is really important because you actually get to see this early on in the battle, but this photo is actually was quite controversial and many years later. So on the 25th of December, 1943, the Seaforth Highlanders held their Christmas dinner for the men back at the Santa Maria di Constantinople, pulling each company out one at a time to enjoy the meal before going back into the action. This photo is of D Company of the Seaforth Highlanders at the Christmas dinner. And actually, much later on in the 50s and 60s, and even into the 70s, many Seaforth Highlanders said that couldn't be them at the Christmas dinner because they ate dinner inside of the church. So this could not be it. But a couple members of the Seaforth's D Company said, no, we're there. This is me. There's a gentleman smiling in the corner of the photo, and there's a few other people that have been positively identified. So this is D Company, and this was the overflow from people from headquarters and support company and D Company, and they had to eat outside. And this is in a little garden just outside of the church in the grounds. So this is actually the Seaforth Highlanders on the 25th of December, and it's their D Company men. It was an interesting story to read because, of course, many people were it was quite a controversy amongst the members of the Seaforths. And again, this was their last meal in some cases for some of these men. They were literally pulled out of action, and some men died going into the meal, and some men died going right back into action. So that same day, the LER also held a dinner, but it wasn't recorded, nor is it as celebrated. There's no photos of it, but they did a very similar thing as well. The LER started their move against the third city square this day, but the progress was painfully slow. Tanks and the anti-tank guns had to be fired into the old castle at the far end of town, the Castello. But the enemy were firing back, and it cost the Canadians 2 tanks. It was a slow, ugly, grueling fight. The entire battle, every time they turned around, they would be rolling grenades downstairs and moving hundreds of yards or dozens of yards at a time. Was very hard, and it was causing a lot of strain on the infantry. The 26th of December, the Canadian attack carried on, with a thrust by the Seaforth Highlanders starting at the school and moving up the road called the Via Monte Manorelli, reaching the town hall, as well as moving up the Via Carbor to link up with the LER. The LER drove up the Corso Umberto towards the castle and to the San Tommaso Cathedral. And that San Tommaso Cathedral, there's some photos of it. It was literally flattened by the Germans. So what happened at this point was, as they were moving towards the town hall and their house clearing, they discovered some tunnels. And that really actually concerned the Canadians, because they realized now that the Germans were moving around behind them. And so the Canadian Pioneer Platoon moved through and started blowing up any and every tunnel entrance that they could find around the Canadian LER lines. Unfortunately, though, another flamethrower was brought up and tried to be used on the Canadians, but the Canadians got the drop on the flamethrower guy, and they took him out quite a way. But the Three Rivers Regiment lost 2 more tanks on the 26th, one to an anti-tank gun and another to something called a beehive, which was a charge that they dropped on the roof. And again, these AT guns were dragged into position. The Canadians were now dropping buildings onto the Germans, and the Canadians finally gained control to the entrance of the last square on the 26th, which is the one not far from the cathedral. So what is interesting is I've never mentioned a single artillery bombardment other than the rolling barrage coming into the town. And the reason that it was not heavily bombarded was because they didn't think the Germans were going to defend it. And so the Canadians couldn't use a lot of artillery fire because they wanted to keep it so that it would be usable as a town. But the artillery fire, just indirect fire, just was not working. Artillery shells would hit things, but these are big, heavy stone buildings. Some of them would topple. But it was really a direct fire type of battle. And there was no strategic air bombardment either, which was, again, a very unique set of situations for this battle. So the end of the battle, on the 27th of December, about 100 more reinforcements arrived, rebuilding what was left of the shattered C Company of the LERs. And it brought with it a new company commander, a guy named Captain Wright. And it was a savage day for the LERs, because after all these reinforcements walked up, an LER platoon under command of a man named Lieutenant E.B. Allenway was wiped out. All 23 of them were killed when the Germans blew up the house they had just taken. They had booby-trapped it, and they dropped the entire building on them. The A Company LER was so upset they wanted revenge, and so they moved under a cover of a smokescreen with their pioneers up to a house that they knew was occupied by the Germans and rigged it to blow, which they did, toppling the building on top of 50 Germans, killing them all. It ended up that it took 3 days of digging through the rubble of that house. And you can see roughly where the house is in the square with the blue arrow. That building no longer exists, obviously, because it was toppled. There was a lone survivor, in fact, was pulled out of the wreckage of that on the 30th of December. His name was Lance Corporal Roy Boyd, and he actually survived the war, which is pretty impressive when you had a building dropped on it. The fighting was so tough in this little stage of the area, in this last part of the battle, that the Loyal Edmonton Regiment mortar platoon fired 1,100 high explosive mortar bombs in a single day on the 27th of December. They finally gained control of the square, the third square opposite the cathedral. It's hard to imagine that a mortar platoon could fire 1,100 bombs in a day, but they did. Today was also, on the 27th of December, the first day that naval gunfire was used to support the attack, adding to a heavy weight of fire. This actually helped reduce German positions in the cemetery and around the castle, allowing them to, or sorry, by the cemetery and kind of northwest of the town, helping them be taken by the Seaforth Highlanders. The 28th of December brought an end to the battle itself, when the Loyal Edmonton Regiment sent patrols forward, and at 9:45 that the fortress at the end of the town was clear of Germans. While this was happening, the carrier and pioneer platoons of Support Company were still trying to find the survivors of Lieutenant Allen Way's platoon. The PPCLI then pushed 2 companies through the town to keep contact, stopping about 2 kilometers north of the town. The suddenness and the quickness of the German pullout is reported and is heavily recorded in many accounts that they just left their bodies lying everywhere. Really unusual. The Germans were very good about policing up and pulling their wounded and cleaning up the battlefields. In this case, they didn't. They literally just left. And so it was kind of a gory, messy scene for the Canadians to stumble into. So the picture on the right is the ruins inside the town of Ortona. As you can see, buildings are smashed, and this is not as bad as some of them, but you can see a couple where some of the mouse holes had been put before the building came toppling down on them. It was a really tough fight. So the casualties were absolutely terrible at Ortona. The Edmonton Regiment lost 63 killed and 109 wounded. The Seaforths lost 41 killed and 62 wounded. The Three Rivers Regiment lost another 10 killed and 20 wounded. The Germans lost about 455 killed, and they figure about 412 wounded. But the worst of it was there was 1,314 Italian civilians, residents of the town of Ortona, that were killed in the heavy fighting. So I made mention of an anti-tank gun being pushed. The photo on the right, that's the 21st of December. Those are LER anti-tank gunners pushing one of their guns through the town. So you can tell the roads aren't very big, and they're trying to push this thing over the rubble because they can't drive it with the Jeep. So in 8 days of fighting, just to give you kind of a perspective of how ferocious, not just the casualties, but how terrible the fighting was in Ortona, the LER itself, the Edmonton Regiment, expended 918 anti-tank shells, 4,050 3-inch mortar shells, 2,000 2-inch mortar shells, 57,000 rifle rounds, 4,800 submachine gun bullets, 180 60 Piat bombs, which is an anti-tank weapon, infantry portable, man portable, 600 number 36 fragmentation grenades, 1,200 smoke grenades. We don't have the expenditure rates of the 75 millimeter tank shells or the machine gun ammunition or the rest of the artillery, but that is just 1 unit's worth of fighting. That's not the Seaforth, that's just the Loyal Edmonton Regiment's expenditures in 8 days of fighting. And this is a badly depleted battalion. So this should tell you, like, literally how ugly the fight was. It was an absolutely brutal fight. So the Morrow River Cemetery. So the Morrow River Cemetery is just south of Ortona and is the main cemetery, holding 1,600 burials from the Second World War, and specifically the about 500 Canadians that were killed in December of 1943, including all of the dead from the fighting in Ortona. They were originally interned in a temporary cemetery just outside of the town, and they're now here. This is one of the prettiest and most remarkable cemeteries to visit. So I visited it last time in 2021. It was in the height of water shortages. It was very, very hot weather. And the only green grass I had seen in all of that part of Italy was this cemetery. And the roses were in full bloom. They were watering. It's magnificent. So it's hedged around it. There's a beautiful gate that you drive in, a little chapel area there. There's an Indian Army soldier in the very back corner. But these are almost all Canadians. And as my wife actually served with the Loyal Edmonton Regiment as their RSS chief clerk 12, 13 years ago now. And so she was actually very struck by how many members of her regiment that she had served with were interned there. So it's a very moving place for a Canadian cemetery. So there are some Canadians missing from the battle. Those Canadians that are missing either are unknowns because they couldn't be identified. They will be an unknown in the cemetery, or if they're unknown, their bodies were never recovered, which I could not confirm, but I'm sure there were. They're at the Monte Cassino Memorial to the Missing of the Italian campaign. But this is worth it. So I usually take, when I do this tour, I do the battlefield first, and then when we finish at the castle, we actually go down to the Moore River Cemetery and see the price of it. The castle at the end of town actually was heavily damaged in the fighting, and the back half of the castle actually collapsed and is heavily damaged, but it's been repaired and renovated enough that you can actually enter the castle now today. Does anybody have any questions?